Good morning. Welcome back. I hope you're having a good Saturday. Might be early where you are. Not too early here. I had this whole talk planned for today, had it all done at the beginning of the week, and which was really unusual. And then this morning, all this information comes through, and I'm like, oh, this is what you're supposed to share. So I switched plans, which means that I'm not as prepared as I normally am. Try to be. And so I might be reading a little bit more than I normally do. So what came today was, and this is one of those things that I can see has been building for, I think, a couple of weeks. And it would be like a little bit more would come, and then a little bit more would come, and then something else would happen, and I would get a little bit more. And even in the middle of the night when I was lying awake, more came, and so this morning it all seemed to come together, and I thought I would talk about it today. If, in case you haven't read the title for today's talk, it's about what's true. And what has been coming to me over these past several weeks is how much of what we perceive is like an objective truth. And as I've often talked about, so in childhood, we have these experiences that basically are laying the tracks in our brains about who we are, what the world is, how it works, about life, and all these different aspects of things are getting fed into us, ideas about money, about religion, about other people, about our place in the world. Like all of these things are getting set up as a child and reinforced over and over and over again until they become like driving a car, right? Where you don't even think about it. Things are just become so automatic. That's the way our world becomes. Once we get all that conditioning in place, it's all so automatic that we don't even recognize it. It's baked in. And these views get reinforced even through adulthood. And when, like what I talk about with the fairy tales, is these patterns. And so oftentimes the patterns are what gets set up in how we see this repetition happening in our lives. So it usually isn't until we begin to challenge these ideas, if we ever even have that idea or have that opportunity to challenge what we've been conditioned to believe and what our inheritance is. And it's not unless we do that we can kind of begin to parse through these ideas and say, is this something that's serving me? Is this something I should keep? Is this even true? Like we just assume that so much of what we think and believe about the world and ourselves is true. Doesn't even have to be things that are triggering. It can be things that don't trigger us, that are just so embedded and accepted that we don't even recognize them, and we don't even think to challenge them, because this is just the way the world is. This is just the way it works. I mean, like, what's there to challenge? So everyone has their own reality, which they believe is true, because each person's view is based on that conditioning and their beliefs. And then what happens is their experiences then reflect those beliefs. So there are various mechanisms in the brain. They talk about, I don't know what the actual statistic is, but we're constantly bombarded by tons of information. And so there has to be some kind of filter, or we would just constantly be overwhelmed with stimulation. And so there are these filters, even before the computers and all that, social media. And so there are these filters that filter out a certain amount of the extraneous information that doesn't seem to be necessary or required, and then just to focus on one thing. So for example, if you're reading a book and there's a noise, like say someone's cutting the grass, and you don't even hear the lawnmower because you're so focused on what you're reading, and then you put the book down for a moment and then you hear the lawnmower and you're like, wow, that's disturbing. But it had been running while you were reading the book, but you had filtered that out because your brain had said, well, that's not important right now. It's not something that's like threatening to you or anything like that. So it just filters it out while you're focused on what you're reading. So the reticular activating system, the RAS, is one of these mechanisms that filters things out based on expectations, previous experiences, and our understandings of the world. So the example that you always see with the reticular activating system when people are describing it is when you're going to buy a car and you decide you're going to get a particular car. Oh, I'm going to get this car because like hardly anybody has it. I never see it around. That would be cool. I'd have a unique car. And then, everybody's got the car. You thought you were unique, and turns out that you weren't the unicorn, that you end up seeing it everywhere. And that's because that reticular activating system now has this item, taken this item and made this item something that moves to the front and becomes part of what is noticed. I also talk about this with regard to if you grow up in a family where they value one particular thing. So say that your family values the intellect, then what things might get excluded? Let's say emotion, the arts, sports, like those things. Just again, it's not like there's this, as I've said before, it's not like there's like this overt rejection of these things. It's just that they're not kind of in the sphere of understanding. Like I said to somebody before, I said, I never knew growing up like that people went hiking. Like that just wasn't a thing that my family ever did. I didn't know there were trails and hikes. I mean, it's not like I was stunned when I found out, but I was like, isn't that interesting? Like it was just something that didn't enter into my worldview. So I didn't really realize it. That may seem silly to some, especially if you've like grown up just kind of knowing about that, but I really didn't. And one of these like ways that I said like all these little pieces were kind of slowly coming together. One was I was watching the Tour de France. I know I'm a little behind. It's over, so don't tell me anything. Don't tell me who wins, because I'm in the middle of it. I'm 2/3 of the way through it. But anyway, they talk about this one guy who's really there are two guys that are kind of at the top if you don't follow it, and they're kind of the like number one and two, and they flip flop like from year to year. And so the number one guy for the past 2 years had an accident 3 weeks before the tour, and he was in the hospital for 3 weeks. And so he hadn't been on a bike for 3 weeks and then jumped into the tour. He didn't know if he'd ever even ride a bike again, but he did. So he's in the tour, and so they're talking about this other guy who's been the number two for the past 2 years. And they're like, oh, he's the best. He's number one. Well, he's been training like mad for like months and months and months. And they're completely ignoring the fact that this guy has been in the hospital for 3 weeks. And I'm like, how could they be like, the way that they're talking about it is like they're completely like acting like this hasn't been the case and like they're on equal footing. And so it's just fascinating to watch how they're looking at something with this particular worldview, and they're not like allowing all of the information in. So you maybe heard me talk about these things being ignored, unseen, unheard, not validated. And when those things happen, like I was saying with the sports and all of that, then those things go into the unconscious. So like if your family prefers intellectual, if that's what is superior, and emotion is ignored and devalued and all of that, then the emotion goes into the unconscious. And so that you might not even realize, I know for myself this was the case, and I didn't even realize like that the emotion was in the unconscious until in my 30s. I was like, look at, like, people cry at this and they cry at that, and I don't have that ability. And I made the decision then that like this is one of those times where you can take things back, and I realized like I don't have that access to that and I want to. So I just made it a point and a focus to begin to reconnect to my emotion, which fortunately I did. And so now I have access to a much wider range of emotion because of that choice I made to not follow along with my family. And like when my grandmother died, I wanted to speak at the funeral. And it was funny because my mother was like, yeah, we talked about that. You can't talk. And I was like, why not? And she said, because you'll make everybody cry. Right? That was like this. It was the only time I really remember the message, other than in childhood, being that overt, like as an adult, like that yeah, we don't want to go there at a funeral. Go figure. So the another way to see this too, another example is like with religion. And imagine if you go to church every week and week after week you're hearing the same stories and the same beliefs over and over and over again, then you're being conditioned. And then what happens is you're taking that conditioning, that becomes a filter through which you see and interpret events in your life. So if you, for example, believed in a punishing Old Testament God, and then something bad happens to you, like this, this happened to Job in the story about what happens to him, and then his friends come along because he's, all these quote unquote bad things have happened to him. His friends come along and they're like, well, you must have done something wrong because you're getting punished by God. You seem so pious and such a religious, kind of goody two shoes. And here, look, this wouldn't happen to you unless you had done something wrong. So that belief system is what got filtered, the events got filtered through, and it shapes how we see. So as I started this off with like what's true, if you were conditioned to believe that, then your worldview would reflect that. Your experiences would reflect and reinforce that because you would continue to interpret events through that lens. So again, this idea that, what I think is true and what you're thinking is not true. And like, sometimes we're like, how could you believe that? Like, that's crazy. But from their perspective, it just may not be so crazy because of all of these things that feed into that particular worldview. This is the way life works. Life reflects, as you've heard me talk over and over again, life is reflecting our consciousness back to us. It's reflecting our beliefs back to us in order for us to clear them, in order for us to free ourselves from these erroneous ways of seeing the world that don't serve us and that are out of alignment with what I believe is a deeper truth, a capital T truth that works for everybody. And so I also talked to my sister, who's, like I said, we are family valued intellectual. I have a doctorate in psychology. My sister is very smart. She's a Mensa member, very rational, literal, logical, practical, scientifically oriented. She wants the details, she wants the research, she wants the facts. So I told her about this crazy thing that happened the other day. And I was writing about my dog, Odie. It's this little Shih Tzu who, he's not with me anymore, but he was just the quirkiest dog ever. He was so funny. He did the craziest things. And he had this one thing as a puppy that he did where he would grab the end of the toilet paper roll and he would run with it. And so we'd come back and there would be toilet paper everywhere. We eventually had to start Odie proofing the house. You have to okay, did you close the bedroom door? Did you get rid of the garbage? Did you close the bathroom doors? Did you put the Kleenex up? Like all these things that he used to get into. And he eventually grew out of it, fortunately. But anyways, a puppy, he would do this. He would grab the toilet paper. And so I had written about this. And then I decided to take a break. I went online and I got that Temu ad. I don't know if you get that, but there's like 8 different little square pictures. I looked over And at the bottom, there was this little picture of that looked exactly the same as my dog. The exact same coloring, which wasn't a common coloring. He's white with tan and a little bit of black. It was a little Shih Tzu, exactly like him. It was the only, I've never seen a dog in one of their ads ever. So it's this little dog holding a roll of toilet paper. So for a moment, I was like, okay, people talk about this. You hear them talk about, like, are they listening to me? And I was like, okay, they can't be listening because I wasn't saying anything. I was typing something in more Microsoft. So, wait, Microsoft monitoring what I wrote? But wait a minute. It couldn't be monitoring what I wrote because I didn't write what the dog looked like. And here the dog looked exactly the same. I don't even think I might have said Shih Tzu, but anyway, not the coloring. And I was like, and then, like, that would get fed to a Temu ad? I mean, like, that's just not possible. And so my sister immediately dismissed it, of course. She was like, yeah, I know. Stuff like that's happened to me before. And then she told me about how she got this cat. And this cat had a coloring she wasn't used to seeing. And she thought it was unique. And then, after she gets the cat, then she sees all these cats that have the same coloring, which is exactly the thing, like I said, with the car, right? The reticular activating system, selecting those things once it becomes something that's relevant to you. But the dog with the toilet paper? Like, I don't even know what it was. I don't even know, like, I thought about it later, and I was like, I should have clicked on it just to see what it was. I mean, was it a dog toilet paper holder? I don't even know what it was. Was it a stuffed animal? It was like the craziest thing. Well, who would think to put those two things together? Anyway, so that's an example of how, like, my example was not about the toilet paper and the dog. My example was about worldview, because she has that literal, logical, rational worldview that says, like, looks at things literally. She isn't able to, like, take in the idea that I'm more open to, like, synchronicities and things that are just not explainable through that lens, right? This really feeds into so much of what I talk about in terms of how are we allowing that worldview that opens up to the feminine, to the right brain, to things that aren't logical, literal, and rational. And this was actually what my talk today was going to be about, which I'll probably do next week, is how do we open to these other ways of perceiving and allow them to filter into our consciousness. This really, in a lot of ways, does tee up that talk. I hadn't realized that till right now. Does tee up this talk for next week. So her worldview is just, again, we're sisters. We didn't spend our whole life together, but our worldviews are very, very different. I'd say mine was probably very much like hers when I was younger, but over time has really opened up and changed because of dreams that broke down ways of seeing the world, because of working with the fairy tales and stories and religion and symbolism. Really all were ways of shifting how I saw. And as I've talked before also about what I believe is the importance of symbolism to taking on a new worldview. Because, as I've said, that quote from Arrival, where they said, I'm paraphrasing, that, a new worldview, when you take on a new language, you're actually taking on a new worldview, because that is exactly like what I'm saying. Like, it becomes a filter, and the language of a culture shapes how that culture perceives the world. Like, I'm sure you've heard, I don't know, I've heard this isn't true, but like they say that people in Arctic areas have a lot more words for snow than we do, because they need to know, like, is it snow that you can walk on that's hard enough that you don't fall through, or is it snow that's hard to walk in because you clunk and you just keep dropping through, like, so things like that, where we wouldn't think of it in areas that just get regular snowfall. that in other areas where their life is living in that, they have a lot more ways of describing it because it affects how they operate in the world. So all these things filter in and determine what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. So again, which I've talked about a few weeks ago, is politically. So politically, are we saying like the other side is wrong and we're right? It just seems so obvious. That's what's so crazy about it. It seems so obvious that it would be there's a right and wrong. There's an objective reality. But isn't it funny that we think our reality is the right one and theirs is the wrong one, and they think theirs is the wrong one? I mean the right one and ours is the wrong one. And again, if you're in that, and they talk about these bubbles we have where we're surrounded by people who just support and reinforce and believe the world is the same as we do. And the more that we are able to open to this, I think we can have more compassion for understanding other views and not feel so threatened personally by in some instances, by these other ways of seeing the world, because they really, if you are immersed in that, it may be something that you can understand a little bit better. I remember when I went to see my grandfather once, I happened to pick up the newspaper he was reading, and I was like, oh, once I began to read, it was the information was presented. It was the other political party. It was presented in such a way that was so plausible, and so it didn't seem out there. It didn't seem like illogical and irrational, and it seemed just really believable. And it was the first time I was like, wow, I can see how this would be something that they would believe. So think about that. So your conditioning then aligns you with a particular worldview, and then that would be the group that you would gravitate to, is the people who have the same worldview. And so then you would kind of feed into each other. Oh, did you hear this? And did you see that? All supporting that particular worldview. And I think what you're seeing a little bit in the culture right now is this attempt to start breaking down these walls of separation for like who has this corner on the truth and what is the truth. And I saw an article recently where a woman was writing about the new AI that is available on cell phones that can change pictures. So we have often thought of this, was one of the things that kind of fed into this narrative I've been working with, is that we have often looked at the image as the objective reality. Like, oh, if you look at here's a picture, and this picture is showing you what's true. It doesn't matter what anybody said or what anybody wrote, but here's the actual snapshot of what happened. And now with the AI that you can get on a cell phone, you have the ability to manipulate things in such a way that this woman was writing in this article that you can't tell it's manipulated. Like in the past, there would always be some little glitch, some little something that if you really looked at the picture, you could see, oh, look, this doesn't match up. But she said it's so perfect now that you don't even see. It's seamless. And so she took pictures that that are like iconic pictures, like Tiananmen Square, and they took the guy out of the picture. And so you can't even tell. And so she was saying, like, I mean, you can change history. You could change, like, what happened, what didn't happen, and you can't. So now we're not going to be able to rely on photographs as evidence of what's objectively true. And so we're looking at all of these different viewpoints now. They're all really coming to the surface about like the truth is in people's truths, and what's happening is really getting pushed up. So it's really fascinating to see that it's causing us to question what's true. And the more that we question what's true, the more that the layers get peeled away. And I think that's what's happening for me over these past several weeks, is that this question is beginning to really pull back the layers of understanding. You think like something as simple as saying that this is my family, or my child, or my sister. And the thing is that these things aren't like the way that we see them, because as I've said before, if you're the soul that's incarnated, then in fact these things are just a part of the experience. There is no real, because you aren't the body, and all these things are based on the body, being in the body in the world, that it's not like that actual connection is something that is really true. Or looking at the sky and saying the sky is blue when the sky really actually isn't blue. It looks blue because of, the way the light filters through the atmosphere. So it's like these things that we just assume the sun rising and setting is not really accurate, because the earth is turning and the sun is staying still. So there's like these subtleties in the way, and all these things have been coming to me for the past couple of weeks, like all these ways of perceiving that we believe are a certain way that aren't. And the time that one of the times that I really saw this was when I went to India, and it was the first time I really experienced culture shock. It was so different than anything I'd ever experienced before. I had one brief experience of it, but nothing to the extent that I felt in India. It's so vastly different than what I had experienced, any of the traveling I'd done. Like I was just like like my senses, like if you think about it, your senses are filtering. And so because there was nothing familiar, and it was like sensory overload, because my brain didn't know how to filter it. And I just remember like staring, like everything was fascinating, everything was different, everything. I couldn't imagine that much stuff being different. And at one point it was overwhelming, and that's apparently my understanding of culture shock. And it was so pronounced that I was aware of it. It was so pronounced that I was like I think what happens is that we have boxes, and you see this sometimes, like if somebody meets you and they say, "Oh, you remind me of my friend or my sister or whatever." And so we have these boxes that we tend to put things in. Like, oh, this is like this, and this is like that. And in that particular situation, there were no boxes to put anything in. There was no way to kind of categorize and acclimate to what was happening. So everything was new. Everything was fresh. I mean, this is one of the benefits of traveling, is to begin to see how you are putting things in these boxes in order to categorize and move through the world. So let me see that. So we tend to relate to our present experience based on our past, and we label things based on what's familiar. And the first time I processed fear, I was like, oh my God, I've been processing emotion for years at that point. And I was like, I've never processed this before. It was so strange because it was so unfamiliar. Felt so different than everything else, that it came into my, I was fully aware of it because of that. So in some ways, what I found also interesting about this is that I've also noticed how across life we can have situations and experiences that feel somewhat significant in the moment, that contradict the basic understanding of the world and how it works. Like, let's say my sister, I would imagine she probably has had these other types of experiences that just get ignored and dismissed because they don't fit into that expectation and that framework of the worldview. And I've been fascinated by this. Why could, I have all these experiences that don't align with the beliefs that I have inherited. And despite that, all those different experiences that could have changed my perception of the world, for some reason there's still this adherence to the original inherited belief. There hasn't been the change despite all the contradictory evidence across time. And I really wonder about that. Like, why don't we change when that other information comes in? And why I think this is so significant is, again, this thing that I've been focusing on for a couple of weeks is really shifting in to that right brain worldview and really trying to understand it more deeply. What is that and how do we do it? And so these contradictory experiences that we've probably all had, like that's what we want to allow in. That's what we want to shift into, because in some instances they can be more true than what we believe now, and they could be more aligned with the new worldview, right? Because we've had this worldview that's based on separation. They talk about this with regards to physics and science. Like, lots of times, in order for, it takes so long sometimes for new information, like in physics especially, to begin to filter into the consciousness of the culture. And they say lots of times, like, they have to wait until previous generations have actually died and have actually left whatever it is, research, universities, wherever this work is done. They have to actually leave and pass away in order for the new information to come in, because again, their worldview is such that it can't expand. They don't expand that much. They for some reason can't open up enough to allow that new information that can completely contradict their worldview. There's just this uncertainty as to how to allow that to filter in. And so the ego is based on these boxes and this structure of these beliefs, which you've been hearing me talk about. The ego wants things to stay the same. It wants things to stay predictable because it feels safe. So to open up and expand is to allow this other things, the inexplicable, that which that doesn't make sense, that which may turn your whole world upside down in terms of what's what and what's true and what means what, right? You have to be willing to go through this chaos of uncertainty where there is a question of not knowing what's actually true, not needing that old foundation of understanding the world based on your conditioned mind, being able to slowly even let that go in order to make space for something entirely new that very much is probably going to break down. So what happens is we often know this stuff. We often know this stuff in our mind, but it doesn't somehow filter down into the implications of it. Like, most of us know we're all connected. Most of us know, we've heard that. Physics has talked about that, like, it's out there. But to really live that is taking it to another level. And that's where we're going in order for humanity to evolve. We have to evolve and open up to these other ways of knowing that we are all connected. There are other laws at play here that we haven't been aware of that are going to change not only how we see the world, but how we interact with the world, how we see others, how we see ourselves, how we operate in the world. Everything is going to change. And all of this, these different perceptions, I think, are ways of beginning to really break this down. The more I talk, the more I see, oh, this is how this fits in. This is how this all works together. We're in the process of changing our worldviews, and it's conscious. It's a conscious shift, as opposed to most of what's gone before, which is unconscious. So we're bringing as much awareness to this point, in this inflection point. This, as I've said, we're like a fork in the road. We have the culture pushing back right now on the feminine, the emergence of the feminine. And so and this is happening all over, not just in the US. And so we're at this point where there's this pushback. So what's our next step then? Is to continue to embody this new worldview. And that's next week. That was what I was going to talk about today, but that's what I'll go into next week, is the embodiment of the new consciousness. All right. I talked about my own story a lot more than I normally do here today, but all right. Hopefully everything's okay. I'm going to try to remember to drop the newsletter down below, the link for it if you haven't signed up. And you can also sign up on my homepage. There's a link, I think, at the top. So thank you for listening. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.